The workmen found her on a Tuesday morning in March 1924 when the sledgehammer finally broke through the brick. They'd been hired to renovate the basement of the Vane estate outside Richmond, Virginia, a sprawling Georgian manor that had stood empty for 3 years following the death of its last owner. The new buyer wanted modern plumbing, electric lights, perhaps a wine cellar. What they discovered instead was a chamber that shouldn't have existed. Windowless, doorless, accessible only through a wall that had been sealed from the outside with fresh mortar sometime in the spring of 1899. Inside, beneath a coating of dust, so thick it seemed like snow, lay the preserved remains of a young woman in a nightgown. Her hair was still pinned. A silver locket hung at her throat, and beside her, arranged with deliberate care, were the remnants of what appeared to be a final meal: a porcelain teacup, a dinner plate, and a crystal decanter that had once held water, now long evaporated. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for 25 years. The local paper identified her within the week. Naomi Vane, only daughter of tobacco magnate Charles Vane, who had vanished without trace in April 1899 at the age of 25. Her disappearance had sparked a months-long manhunt. Investigators had dredged rivers, questioned vagrants, followed leads as far as New York and Charleston. They'd suspected foul play, elopement, even amnesia. No one had thought to knock on the walls of her own home. But what the coroner couldn't explain, what still haunts the archives of the Richmond Historical Society, was the expression frozen on Naomi Vane's face. Not terror, not anguish. Something closer to resignation, as though she'd known exactly where she was and why she could never leave. This is the story of how an heiress became a ghost in her own house, and the dark inheritance that sealed her fate. But before we uncover what happened in that hidden room, we need to go back to where it all began. If you're ready to descend into one of history's most disturbing mysteries, hit that like button, and let's begin. To understand how Naomi Vane ended up entombed beneath her family home, you first need to understand the weight of the Vane name in turn-of-the-century Virginia. Charles Vane had built his tobacco empire during the Reconstruction, when fortunes could still be made by men willing to work the ruins of the Old South into something new. He was not old money. His father had been a grocer. But by 1875, he'd accumulated enough wealth to purchase a colonial estate on the outskirts of Richmond and enough ambition to renovate it into something that announced permanence. The Vane Manor wasn't the largest house in the county, but it was perhaps the most deliberately imposing. 3 stories of red brick, white columns, formal gardens designed by a landscape architect, imported from Philadelphia. Charles married late, at 40, to a woman named Catherine Shaw, 20 years his junior, and the daughter of a prominent Charleston family whose own fortune had not survived the war. The marriage was strategic on both sides. She brought respectability, he brought security. Their only child, Naomi, was born in 1874, the same year the manor's renovations were completed. By all accounts, Naomi's childhood was one of privilege and isolation in equal measure. She was educated at home by a succession of tutors. Charles didn't believe in boarding schools or in exposing his daughter to influences he couldn't control. She learned French, piano, watercolor painting. She read voraciously, novels, philosophy, history. Visitors to the estate remembered her as precocious and unnervingly perceptive. The sort of child who would sit silently through adult conversations and then ask questions that revealed she'd understood more than anyone realized. Catherine died of pneumonia in 1888 when Naomi was 14. After that, the household contracted even further. Charles dismissed most of the staff, keeping only a housekeeper, a cook, and a groundskeeper. Father and daughter lived in a house designed for entertaining, but they rarely had guests. Naomi's social circle consisted almost entirely of her father's business associates and their wives, women 2 or 3 decades older than herself, who regarded her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She never attended a dance. She never had suitors call. Charles, it seemed, had no intention of letting her marry. When asked about his daughter's prospects, he would say vaguely that Naomi was too intelligent for the average young man, or that she preferred her studies. What he meant, though few dared say it aloud, was that Naomi represented his immortality. She was the vessel into which he'd poured his ambition, the guarantee that the Vane name would outlast him. He began grooming her to inherit everything. By the time she was 20, Naomi attended business meetings with her father, reviewed contracts, managed household accounts. She had a mind for numbers and an instinct for negotiation that impressed even Charles's most skeptical partners. She was, by 1894, effectively running portions of the Vane tobacco operation, a scandalous arrangement for the time, but one that Charles defended fiercely. But control is a cage, even when gilded. And by 1898, as Naomi approached her 25th birthday, something in the household began to shift. The few people who still visited the estate noticed changes. Naomi spoke less, smiled rarely. She'd grown pale and thin. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. When the housekeeper asked if she was unwell, Naomi would only say she'd been having trouble sleeping. Charles, meanwhile, had become obsessed with legacy. He commissioned a family crypt in the local cemetery, far larger than necessary for two people. He revised his will repeatedly, adding codicils and conditions. He spoke often, to anyone who would listen, about bloodlines, about duty, about the terrible burden of ensuring that everything you'd built didn't crumble the moment you closed your eyes. And then, in April 1899, Naomi disappeared. The morning of April 17th, 1899, began like any other at the Vane estate. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, arrived at 6 to light the kitchen stove. The cook, Mary Hodge, came shortly after to prepare breakfast. Charles Vane took his coffee in the study, as always, at 7 o'clock sharp. It was Mary who first noticed something wrong. She'd brought Naomi's breakfast tray, soft-boiled eggs, toast, tea, upstairs at 7:30, the same time every morning. But when she knocked on Naomi's bedroom door, there was no answer. She knocked again. Silence. Cautiously, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed had been slept in. The sheets were thrown back. But Naomi was gone. Her nightgown was missing. Her house slippers were missing. But her day clothes still hung in the wardrobe. Her jewelry box sat undisturbed on the dresser, and her reading glasses rested on the nightstand beside a half-finished book. Mary set down the tray and hurried to find Mrs. Brennan. Together, they searched the house, the parlor, the conservatory, the library, the other bedrooms. They checked the kitchen, the pantry, the cellar stairs. They called Naomi's name until their voices echoed off the high ceilings. Nothing. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Brennan knocked on Charles Vane's study door and informed him that his daughter was missing. Charles's reaction, according to Mrs. Brennan's later testimony, was strange. He didn't rise from his desk. He didn't demand to search the house himself. He simply sat there, staring at the papers in front of him, and said quietly, "She can't have gone far." But when Naomi didn't reappear by noon, Charles finally summoned the groundskeeper and sent him to fetch the county sheriff. By mid-afternoon, a search was underway. Deputies combed the estate grounds, checked the stables, questioned the neighbors. No one had seen Naomi leave. The gates had been locked overnight, as always. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle. It was as though she'd simply evaporated. The investigation intensified over the following weeks. The sheriff brought in bloodhounds, who lost Naomi's scent at the edge of the garden. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the Vane household: tradesmen, business associates, distant relatives. They asked whether Naomi had seemed troubled, whether she'd mentioned running away, whether she'd formed any attachments that might explain a secret departure. The answers painted a portrait of a young woman who'd been, by all appearances, dutiful and resigned. She'd never spoken of leaving. She'd never expressed romantic interest in anyone. Her life had been her father's business and her father's house, and she'd seemed to accept that this would always be the case. Charles himself was questioned extensively. Had he and Naomi argued? Had there been any conflict in the household? He insisted there had not. His daughter, he said, had been perfectly content. He offered a substantial reward for information leading to her return, $5,000, an enormous sum for the time. Newspapers picked up the story. Tobacco heiress vanishes, the headlines screamed. Fortune awaits missing socialite. The coverage was sensational and, in many ways, inaccurate. Naomi had hardly been a socialite, but it kept the case alive in the public imagination. Tips flooded in from across the state. Naomi had been spotted boarding a train in Petersburg. She'd been seen in a hotel in Norfolk. She was living under an assumed name in Baltimore, Washington, Atlanta. None of the sightings led anywhere. As spring turned to summer, the searches grew less frequent. The newspapers moved on to other stories. Charles withdrew even further into his estate, refusing visitors, conducting business only by letter. The house, already quiet, became sepulchral. And then, in October 1899, Charles Vane revised his will one final time. In it, he made a curious provision. If Naomi's fate remained unknown 7 years after her disappearance, she would be declared legally dead. And the entirety of the Vane fortune would be donated to establish a charitable foundation in her name. Not a single dollar would go to extended family members, of which there were several who might have expected an inheritance. Charles died in his sleep in February 1900, less than a year after his daughter's disappearance. He was 59 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who'd seen him in his final months said he'd aged a decade in a matter of weeks, as though grief had hollowed him out from the inside. The estate passed into probate, the house was shuttered, and Naomi Vane passed into legend, the lost heiress, the vanished daughter, the mystery that would never be solved, until the sledgehammer broke through the wall in 1924. The renovations had been routine until they weren't. The new owner of the Vane estate, a businessman named Harold Pritchard, who'd purchased the property at auction in 1921, wanted to modernize the sprawling basement. The space was typical of old Southern homes: low ceilings, brick walls, dirt floors in some sections, used primarily for storage and coal. Pritchard envisioned something more useful, a proper cellar, perhaps even a billiards room. The foreman, a man named Jack Riley, had been taking measurements when he noticed something odd about the eastern wall. The dimensions didn't match the floor plan. According to the architectural drawings, preserved from the 1870s renovations, there should have been approximately 6 more feet of space than what was currently accessible. At first, Riley assumed an error in the drawings. Old plans were notoriously unreliable, but when he tapped the wall, it sounded hollow. He called over 2 of his workers and instructed them to expose the brick. They chipped away the plaster coating, revealing masonry that looked noticeably newer than the surrounding walls, cleaner mortar, less weathering. Someone had built this section more recently, probably within the last 30 or 40 years. Riley made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told the men to break through. The sledgehammer struck once, twice, 3 times. Bricks crumbled. A small opening appeared, releasing a gust of stale air so cold it made the workmen step back. The smell was strange, not decay exactly, but absence, the scent of a place where nothing had lived for a very long time. They widened the hole until a man could fit through, and Riley climbed inside with an electric torch. The beam of light swept across a chamber approximately 10 feet by 12 feet. No windows, no door except the one they'd just created. The walls were bare brick, the floor was stone, and in the center of the room, arranged on what appeared to be a simple cot, were the skeletal remains of a young woman. Riley would later tell police that his first thought was that he'd stumbled into some kind of gothic nightmare, a story by Poe come to life. The body was positioned as though sleeping, hands folded across the chest. The nightgown, though yellowed with age, was intact. Dark hair, still held by tarnished pins, spread across the pillow, and beside the cot, a small table with the remnants of that final meal, the porcelain cup, the plate, the crystal decanter. There was also a candlestick with the stub of a candle burned down to nothing, and a book, its pages too warped and faded to read. Riley backed out of the chamber and told his men to stop work immediately. Within the hour, the Richmond police were on site. By evening, the medical examiner had confirmed what everyone already suspected. This was a human burial, clandestine and deeply disturbing. The investigation moved swiftly. Records from the county clerk's office confirmed that Charles Vane had ordered significant basement renovations in the spring of 1899, specifically in April, just weeks after Naomi's disappearance. He'd hired a small crew, paid them well, and supervised the work personally, which was unusual for a man of his station. More damning, the contractors who'd done the work had all left the area shortly after completing the job. 2 had moved out of state. 1 had died in 1903. None had ever spoken publicly about the nature of the renovations. The medical examiner estimated the remains had been in the sealed chamber for approximately 25 years. The clothing, the jewelry, a locket engraved with the initials NV, and dental records all pointed to the same conclusion. This was Naomi Vane. But how had she ended up there? The answer, investigators believed, lay in the condition of the chamber itself. The room had been sealed from the outside. There was no mechanism by which someone inside could open or remove the bricks. The food, the water, the candle, all suggested that someone had been placed in the chamber alive, with provisions that might last days at most. This wasn't a burial. It was an entombment. The question that consumed the newspapers, the police, and the horrified residents of Richmond was simple and terrible. Had Charles Vane walled his own daughter up alive? And if so, why? The truth began to emerge when investigators examined Charles Vane's personal papers, which had been stored in a bank vault since his death in 1900. Among the documents was a leather journal written entirely in Charles's hand, spanning the years 1895 to 1899. It was not a diary in the traditional sense. There were no daily entries, no personal reflections. Instead, it read like a ledger of anxieties, a catalog of fears about legacy, mortality, and control. The entries grew increasingly paranoid as the years progressed. Charles wrote obsessively about the dissolution of family fortunes, about heirs who squandered inheritances, about the chaos that followed when weak-willed children took control of empires their fathers had built. He cited examples: prominent families that had collapsed within a generation, businesses that had crumbled, names that had vanished from history. "A man's work," he wrote in March 1897, "is only as immortal as the child who inherits it. And what if that child is corruptible? What if they lack vision, discipline, strength? Better no heir at all than one who desecrates your legacy." By 1898, his focus had shifted to Naomi specifically. He'd begun to suspect, without any evidence, that she was planning to leave. He wrote about noticing her gazing out windows, about finding her reading novels that featured female protagonists who defied their families. He convinced himself she was preparing to betray him, to marry some unsuitable man, and dilute the Vane bloodline. "She speaks less," he noted in September 1898. "She withdraws into silence. I know what this means. She is plotting her escape." There was no indication that Naomi had been plotting anything of the sort, but Charles's journal made clear that he'd become convinced of it, and that conviction had led him to a horrifying conclusion. In January 1899, he wrote, "I have considered the problem from every angle. If she leaves, the fortune will be squandered. If she marries, control will pass to a stranger. If she remains unwed, she will grow bitter and reckless. There is only one solution that preserves both legacy and honor." He didn't specify what that solution was, but in March 1899, he began making arrangements for the basement renovations, and in April, Naomi disappeared. Investigators also found a second document, a letter sealed but never sent, addressed to Naomi herself. It was dated April 16th, 1899, the night before she vanished. The letter was long and rambling, but its core message was chilling. Charles explained that he'd come to believe the only way to protect Naomi from herself and to protect his legacy from corruption was to remove her from the world entirely. Not through violence, he insisted he could never harm her, but through preservation. She would become, in his words, a permanent ward of the estate, untouched by time or temptation. He'd drugged her evening tea with laudanum, a common opiate. While she slept, he'd carried her to the hidden chamber he'd prepared beneath the house. He'd left her water, a small amount of food, and a candle, whether as gestures of mercy or symbols of the life she was leaving behind, it was impossible to say. And then, he'd sealed the wall. The letter ended with a justification that read like madness. In this way, you remain mine forever, pure, unchanging, beyond the reach of a world that would ruin you. This is my final gift to you, the gift of eternity within the home that loves you. Charles had never sent the letter because, investigators theorized, he'd realized too late the horror of what he'd done. The rapid decline in his health, the revisions to his will, the withdrawal from society, all suggested a man consumed by guilt. But he'd never confessed. He'd taken the truth to his grave, and Naomi had remained sealed in hers for a quarter century. The medical examiner's report, released 3 weeks after the discovery, confirmed what many had suspected, but hoped wasn't true. Naomi Vane had not died quickly. Based on the skeletal evidence and the condition of the chamber, the examiner estimated she'd survived in the sealed room for anywhere from 3 to 5 days. The amount of water Charles had left, roughly a gallon, would have sustained her for that long, though barely. The food, a small loaf of bread and some preserved fruit, might have extended her survival slightly if she'd rationed it, though there was no way to know if she had. The candle had burned for perhaps 6 hours, giving her light for the first night. After that, she would have been in absolute darkness. The positioning of her remains suggested she'd spent most of her time on the cot. There were no scratch marks on the walls, no signs she'd tried to break through the brick. This absence of struggle disturbed investigators more than any evidence of panic would have. It suggested she'd understood, perhaps immediately, that escape was impossible. Or perhaps she'd been too sedated to fully comprehend her situation at first. Laudanum was a powerful drug. She may have awakened disoriented, believing herself in a nightmare from which she'd eventually wake. By the time the drug wore off and the reality became clear, her strength would have been failing. The book found beside her cot was eventually identified by a paper conservator as a volume of poetry. Tennyson, likely In Memoriam, one of Naomi's favorite works according to her former tutors. She'd brought it with her, or perhaps Charles had placed it there. Either way, it suggested she'd had something to hold on to in those final hours, words about grief and loss, and the permanence of love, read by candlelight until the darkness took over. What had she thought about in that darkness? Had she screamed, knowing no one would hear? Had she blamed herself for some imagined transgression that had led to this punishment? Had she understood that her father, the man who'd claimed to love her above all else, had chosen to preserve her as an object rather than allow her to live as a person? The psychological horror of Naomi's death gripped the public imagination in 1924. The newspapers published extensive coverage, and the case became a symbol of paternal control taken to its darkest extreme. Feminist writers cited Naomi Vane as evidence of how women's autonomy was crushed under the weight of family expectation. Psychologists discussed Charles's journal as a case study in obsessive love disorder, but beneath the analysis and outrage was a simpler, more visceral horror. Naomi had died alone, in the dark, in a room built by someone who claimed to be protecting her. The Vane estate was never renovated. Harold Pritchard, the man who'd purchased it, sold the property immediately after the discovery. The house changed hands several times over the next 2 decades, but no one ever lived there for long. Residents reported feeling watched, hearing footsteps in the basement, finding doors inexplicably locked from the inside. By 1950, the house was abandoned. By 1960, it had fallen into serious disrepair, and in 1972, it was demolished. But before the demolition, historical preservationists photographed the hidden chamber. Those photographs still exist in the archives of the Richmond Historical Society. They show a small, brick-walled room with a low ceiling and a stone floor, a simple cot, a small table, and on the table, still sitting exactly where they'd been found 48 years earlier, a porcelain cup and a crystal decanter, empty, silent witnesses to a death that should never have happened. In the end, the story of Naomi Vane isn't really about ghosts or mystery or the lurid details that captivated newspaper readers in 1924. It's about what happens when love curdles into ownership, when protection becomes imprisonment, when a father decides his daughter's future matters less than his own immortality. Charles Vane wasn't a monster in the conventional sense. He didn't act out of cruelty or sadism. His journal makes clear he believed he was saving Naomi from bad decisions, from corrupting influences, from a world he saw as hostile and degrading. He'd convinced himself that by sealing her away, he was giving her the greatest gift, eternal purity, preserved like a pressed flower in the pages of a book. But that's the insidious nature of control dressed up as care. It doesn't announce itself with malice. It comes wrapped in concern, justified by love, enforced by the very person who claims to want your happiness. Charles built Naomi's prison in the basement of her own home, and he did it believing he was building her a sanctuary. The hidden chamber wasn't an anomaly. It was a literalization of the life Naomi had always lived. The tutors who kept her isolated, the limited social circle, the business education that bound her to her father's ambitions rather than her own, all of it had been walls closing in, brick by brick. The room beneath the house was simply the final, inescapable version of a cage that had been constructed around her since childhood. What makes the story particularly haunting is how preventable it was. Naomi wasn't doomed by fate or cursed by circumstance. She died because one man decided that his vision of her future mattered more than her ability to choose one for herself. And when he realized he couldn't control where she went or who she became, he chose to make sure she went nowhere and became nothing but a memory. His memory, shaped by his grief and guilt. The Vane fortune, incidentally, was distributed exactly as Charles's final will specified. 7 years after Naomi's disappearance in 1906, she was declared legally dead, and the money went to establish the Vane Foundation for the Education of Young Women. The foundation operated for 60 years, providing scholarships and educational opportunities to hundreds of girls across Virginia. It's a bitter irony that Charles's money ended up liberating the very kind of young women he'd worked so hard to control in his own daughter. The foundation's mission statement, written by the executors who'd known Charles, emphasized independence, critical thinking, and the right of women to determine their own paths. Whether this was a deliberate rebuke of Charles's parenting or simply a reflection of changing times, no one can say. But Naomi's death, indirectly, purchased freedom for others. Her grave is in the family cemetery where Charles had commissioned that oversized crypt. She's buried beside him, a final proximity neither of them would have chosen. The headstone is simple. Naomi Catherine Vane, 1874-1899, beloved daughter. The dates are a lie. She died in 1899, but she was lost long before her father sealed that wall. Sometimes the worst prisons are the ones built by people who love you. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who believe they're heroes of their own story. And sometimes the walls are so well constructed, so perfectly disguised as shelter, that you don't realize you're trapped until it's far too late to escape. Naomi Vane learned that truth in a room 10 feet by 12 feet, in darkness that lasted for days. All we can do now is remember her, not as Charles wanted her remembered, frozen in time and owned by history, but as a woman who deserved the chance to walk out the door, make her own mistakes, and build a life that belonged to no one but herself. The house is gone. The chamber is gone. But the warning remains. Be careful who you allow to define your walls. And be even more careful when someone claims those walls are for your own protection. Because the distance between sanctuary and tomb is sometimes nothing more than a layer of brick and a father's twisted love.